So in this section, we're going to talk a little bit about the tools we use to identify how larger blues licks are made up of smaller ones, and also how we can use these tools to help you make up your own licks. We're going to start out by just talking a little bit about how music is like any other language you're going to learn to speak. And we're going to use some grammar analogies that'll probably help people get the idea. There's three main techniques we're going to talk about. These are ways to manipulate the DNA phrases. The first technique is just abbreviation, or just shortening a lick up. The second one is what I call daisy chaining, or just kind of sticking licks end to end. There's some techniques for doing that. And then the third one is what I call nesting, where you take a lick and you kind of stick another lick somewhere in the middle of it where it kind of fits. And you'll find that, if you use these techniques, there's a lot of different ways to combine licks to make them sound really original and fresh, and just, you're never going to run out of ideas if you use these with the DNA phrases. And the way you want to start to think of it is as a structure, whereas the notes are kind of like just letters of an alphabet, and it's not that far of a stretch. When you learn to play guitar, you learn your A, your B, your C, your D, the notes you play are just like the letters of your musical alphabet, both literally and figuratively. And you can think of the DNA phrases as being kind of like syllables, because they're 2 to 4 of these letters, but it's just enough to make up like a little word unit. And it's really hard to make music out of just 1 or 2 notes. It's usually it's just hard to tease it out of that small amount of material. But that 2 to 4 notes, that range it's really an ideal building block for larger things. So I've just found for every reason it works really well, and also. Another similarity with grammar is you'll find, a lot of syllables can be words, but not all syllables are words. Like you'll start to see if I say the word like hap, if I say just hap, it's not really a word. Maybe in Shakespearean English, sort of, but not really in modern English. And similarly, if on guitar, I just kind of go, it's sort of a lick, but really kind of sort of not. Now, if I say the word happy, that's obviously a word. It kind of had that little phrase I said, hap, before, but it's not really... Now when I say happy, it's actually a word. And if I just add one more note to that guitar lick I played before, that's definitely a blues lick. You can't miss it. And it's just that simple addition of that one note. Once I put that A in there, this C and this C sharp kind of have something tonal to be grounded to. This A kind of grounds the phrase and makes it sound a little more appealing to the ear, but when you kind of stick those two, that C and that C sharp together, it kind of gives you that split third effect, which creates the tension of the blues. So it's the chemistry of just those 3 notes that gives you, enough kind of musical material to make it sound like real music. And all the blues phrases that you're going to do in bigger solos are built on this DNA phrase foundation. So just in case you haven't done it yet, make sure you've checked out my videos on the DNA phrases. And if you haven't worked through the DNA exercises at all, the master DNA exercise, make sure you do at least a little bit of that, because that'll start to give you the material you need to do the rest of the things we're going to do in this video. Not every spoken sound works in every language, and not all musical phrases work in every style. So to understand what we're doing with a style, we want to figure out what notes are we using, what kind of phrases make the style work. I'm just going to give some examples from language. If I use a syllable like that particular sound is never going to show up in English. It'll show up in German. There's a word called übel, which means evil in German. But it's that particular vowel it's never in English. So it would never ever show up. And similarly in music, I could take a phrase like this. It just, something about that combination of notes just doesn't work for most Western ears. But it occurs quite a bit in Indian classical music. That's a phrase from a rag called Marwa, which I'll talk a little bit about later. But, knowing that phrase is just not going to work, for certain audiences is going to help you understand, okay, we exclude certain phrases from the type of music we're playing, and we focus on other ones. So with the blues, what we've already talked about in the past few lessons is that we start with some root, and we take the major and the minor pentatonic scales based on that root, and we kind of combine DNA phrases from both those scales to get the sounds that we're looking for. We'll go into the details of how to do that a little bit later in this lesson and in the next lesson, but the main thing you want to know is just those materials: major and minor pentatonic scales, and the DNA phrases that kind of fit into them. And the first technique we were talking about here is just chopping up even the DNA phrases that we have, just letting it be okay to use just fragments of them. And people are going to start to ask right away, well, if you can chop up the DNA phrases, doesn't that mean that there's smaller DNA phrases that we didn't talk about before? And my answer is kind of yes and no. Even though it helps you describe music really well to think of certain things as being fragments of DNA phrases, but there's a couple problems with trying to think of like 1 and 2 notes as DNA phrases. One of them is that using too few notes, it's really just hard to get a juicy vibe out of it. It just doesn't click to people as being music when you use too few notes. So there's something ideal about using 2 to 4 note phrases that works the best. And just as a generality, if you want to look at subphrases, it's easier to just think of the whole theory as being based on these larger phrases. It's just when you're trying to organize like 20 main phrases and trying to think of them as all being equally important, it just gets very confusing. It doesn't really work as a theory. But if you kind of focus on just a smaller number of phrases that are just the right size, it just makes everything click. At least I found it works with everything for me to focus on these 2 to 4 note phrases. At the same time, you're going to see later on a lot of these big licks that we're doing are, they're based on one type of phrase, and there's fragments of one phrase and then the whole version of another phrase, and it works really nicely to describe them that way. And also, when you're playing solos, you're going to find that you could start to tease the listener a little bit by playing only fragments of a phrase, but it's only when they've been prepared a certain way. So that's not, this is beyond theory. This is a completely practical reason to say, okay, I know what lick I'm going to do, but I'm not going to go into the whole thing. So let's say I'm just grooving along here. People could see up to there, I'm doing bluesy types of solos, and if you've heard the blues a lot, those phrases get in your ear. And sort of ended that solo with just it didn't exactly resolve the phrase. You could tell I'm really leaning on it, but you kind of want that note to go to, it's kind of part of the core phrase, that core blues bend, but I didn't quite go there. I just kind of left it hanging. And I think that works because in a way people sort of know what the phrase is. When you're kind of aware, even if it's just subconscious, if the listeners are at least subconsciously aware of what kind of phrases are going on, then it's much easier for a listener to kind of take them places like that. For me to play a phrase like just leave this just kind of hanging out of nowhere, but people to see, okay, I'm kind of screwing with them, but they kind of know I'm screwing with them, so they can kind of play along. If you don't really know that, like if I'm playing Marwa here again, if you don't know that I'm supposed to, if you don't know I'm supposed to resolve it there, people don't kind of expect me to resolve the phrase in a certain way. They're less accepting of stuff that it kind of ends up with, I'm kind of leaning on this, it's kind of leaning on that flat 2 right there, But, the other key part of this is that, even in one performance, you can get a listener used to your phrases. Once you've played things just a couple of times, listeners start to get the phrases in their ear. And when we start to talk about alap, we're going to talk about how Indian performers will take a set of phrases and play them for an audience that might not know them, but they'll kind of generally warm them up to the phrases. So that when they really start to tweak with the phrases later on, the audience kind of gets it and doesn't think that they're just playing a bunch of wrong notes. But the one other really important thing that you need to know about being able to use those abbreviated phrases where you just kind of don't resolve a core phrase, the key is that a lot of it's got to do with intention. If you are doing something that just sounds weird to the ear, there's some things that are just because of the way the intervals work, they sound weird to the ear. I mean, if you do it really skillfully and just really sincerely, you lean into it. When I'm doing this bend, I'm kind of, I'm letting my guitar go with it. You got to watch Steve Vai or Joe Satriani talk about those bends. Whenever they're talking about doing one of their big bends, they're always doing the face. They always do the face like that. And for them, that's their way of saying, yeah, I mean to do this. It sounds kind of tense. But they're just whatever, I'm going right for it. And, you communicating that to your audience will also help them understand, okay, yeah, I meant to play this note. It's not just, some random thing that I'm doing, out of nowhere. Now, if you're playing on a recording and your audience can't hear you, you don't necessarily have those advantages. I mean, that's when you really want to take the time to make sure, okay, does my audience, know what these phrases sound like? And then if I'm going to start to chop them up in weird kinds of ways, you got to know, okay, I've already kind of planted these phrases in their ear. They know what are the unresolved notes, what are the resolved notes, and then, how do I kind of play with that dynamic to make the solo interesting? So, that's one of the keys to abbreviated phrases. And then you're going to see as we start to construct phrases later on, you can start to look at the longer phrases as being, this is a whole phrase, this is a partial phrase. We'll get to more of that in the next section. But the next tool I want to talk about is daisy chains. Daisy chaining is that you're taking the core phrases and you're just kind of sticking them right next to each other in a chain. And, in some ways it seems like kind of an obvious technique. The main reason you want to do this is to try to just get more core phrases in a smaller area. It kind of concentrates the vibe a little bit, just makes it more of whatever it is you're doing. And there's two ways to do this. One of them is just bookending. You've got one phrase here, you got one phrase here, smash them right next to each other, end to end, nothing fancy. The other way is to kind of splice their end note so that, the note that ends one phrase begins another. And I'll just give you two examples of this real quick. One of the really famous licks we're going to do a little bit later, it goes sort of like this. You kind of slide up and you slide down. And this lick is kind of based up of two versions of the blur, the two versions that I explained them exactly this way in the DNA phrase videos. You're in the key of A, and you're sliding from the C up to the C sharp, kind of blurring from the minor to the major third and resolving up to the fifth. That was one of our legal blurred thirds, and the other one is where you're going, you're kind of going from the major to the minor third with a slide. So you kind of take, that's a complete lick, that's a complete lick, and you just put them right next to each other. And those two just occur with each other so much that like that lick right there, and sometimes people play it like this. I'll go into all the details of how people play it later, but the key is that those are just two of these really common blurs, just right next to each other, not sharing any notes, but they just work so well together that it's just become one of these huge phrases that it's just all over country, all over blues rock. It's just everywhere. And for an example of a riff that actually splices the end notes, in the first video I talked about the phrase that gives you the flat fifth. It's kind of like the compound blue third. It's like the blue third of the blue third if you're in the key of A. We got the E flat to D to C to A. And that E flat's your blue note. Well, if you want to think of it as being the compound third, you've got a blue third here on the C too. So what if you just went, did the slide version of the upper note, but then when you got to the C, you bent it and you just made that all one riff. Basically, you didn't change that too much, but instead of just kind of like rolling over the C, like it was nothing, you kind of gave that little bit of extra attention. And you're going to see both of those licks have the C in it, but you just kind of put the emphasis on the C so that you get the bend, you get the blue note in both parts of the lick. And that, that doesn't change the lick incredibly, but it definitely gives it just a little bit more spice than it had before. And so you're going to see with daisy chaining, now that you're starting to overlap notes, the blues vibe is just getting even more concentrated in a smaller area, which is a really, really cool thing. And the next thing we got to talk about is how to nest licks, because that's going to make it even more intense. So nesting is the last melodic technique we're going to talk about for building up the phrases. And you're going to find that this gets your phrases even more concentrated than when you're just daisy chaining on a big end. Because even though that lick right there, it kind of like puts a bunch of things end to end, nesting lets you put phrases, right inside of each other, and that's just going to make things as concentrated as they can possibly be. And it gives you all kinds of cool new potential for hybrid phrases. The main thing I find with is the pentatonic fourth DNA phrase is probably the best one to just be playing with, because it fits the largest interval space. It's got that fourth around it, so there's the most space to work inside of it. And also the pentatonic fourth phrase is kind of bland on its own, so it's the one that tends to want the most to spice it up. So that's a good way to start when you're just kind of messing around with it. But if you remember the shuffle cadence, if you take that phrase up here, and then kind of do it downward. You know, if I daisy chained a blues third on the end of that, you know, that's one way to do it. But if I kind of nested it in the middle, I could go, you know, on my way down, I put the bend right in there. Now it's kind of been nested in the middle of the phrase, so you're kind of getting, you know, that time it was just, that bend was nested right inside that pentatonic fourth there. And so at this point, even if you just take those two phrases, you know, that blues bend and the pentatonic fourth, now, you know, you can daisy chain them and nest them at the same time. Eventually you get to stuff like, it's really, really easy to take the phrases you know and twist them up into nasty stuff really, really quickly just by messing around with, you know, being able to put them end to end and kind of mixing them up within each other. But we'll get into more of the details about how to do that later. So after I worked on this theory up to this point, I really started to want to find a way to classify licks and just understand, okay, how do these kind of, you know, relate to the, you know, the basic concept of the DNA phrases. And I decided I wanted to have like a sort of like an ordering system for like how complex is the phrase. And I mean, the simple formula is how many DNA phrases are there in this larger phrase. And that tells you a little bit about, one, how hard is the lick to play. I mean, obviously, if a lick is really fast, it's hard because it's technical, but also just in terms of note combinations, the more DNA phrases are involved in a lick, the harder it is usually to see it. So, you know, understanding the order of a phrase, as it were, helps you understand that. And it also helps you understand how complex the lick is going to sound. You know, if you've got a lot of DNA phrases in a small area, it's going to be a lot of note combinations involved, and it's going to sound pretty complex to the listener, which could be a good thing. You just want to know that in advance. And so, basically, here's why you want to think of it. The basic DNA phrases that I talked to you about so far, those are what I call first-order phrases. There's just one DNA phrase in them. In the next section of this video, in part 2, all the phrases I'm going to show you are second-order phrases. They're just two DNA phrases that have either been daisy-chained or kind of nested within each other, or just a fragment of one kind of bumped onto another one. But you're going to see, I mean, these phrases get a ton of action. You know, you're going to start to realize you don't need much more than second-order phrases to play all kinds of really crazy stuff. You know, obviously, when you get to Stevie Ray Vaughan, you're getting to, you know, phrases that are just, you know, licks and licks and licks and licks and licks that just go on forever. But, you know, for the most part, you're going to see these second order phrases are a really, really, really big deal in terms of giving you like good sounding blues improvisation. So, I mean, just as a general rule, the simpler a phrase is, the more flexible it is, the easier it is to work it into your playing. And, you know, the more complex it is, the more DNA phrases are in it, the more interesting it's going to sound, the more adventurous. So, I mean, that's just a general guideline to go by as you work through this stuff. But the important things you want to remember from this whole section are 3 ways to manipulate the DNA phrases. There's chopping them up, abbreviating them. There's daisy chaining them, kind of sticking them together either end to end or with the little one linking note there, and then nesting them, kind of inserting one inside another when they have overlapping notes. And in the next section, I'm going to dissect all those famous blues licks and explain to you exactly how they work. And you're going to start to see right away. You're going to find, oh yeah, I know a whole bunch of songs that use this lick. If you have never heard these licks and songs before, I'll give you songs that use them. And I'm going to tell you, you're going to see I have no trouble coming up with songs that use these riffs because they're all over the place. And then finally, I'm going to try to relate these second order phrases back to the master DNA exercise. The question is going to be, how do you start to use these master DNA exercises to work the second order phrases into your playing? And then the final section is going to be about improvisation and just, you know, how you start to develop a more expansive blues vocabulary. How do you really start to work these second order phrases into just fluid jamming on stuff off the cuff?